I'm Professor Kenneth Hansen of the University of Central Florida Judaic Studies program, and I'd like to share an intriguing story with a little help from AI. It's all about an ancient relic that we might call the Moses Scroll. Nearly a century and a half ago, a discovery was made in a long-abandoned desert cave east of the Dead Sea that may in our own times fundamentally change our understanding of the biblical text and the great lawgiver himself, Moses. The year was 1878. A well-known Arab sheikh, Mohammed Erekat, approached a shopkeeper and antiquities dealer in the old city of Jerusalem by the name of Moses Shapira. He was a Jew born in Ukraine who had converted to Christianity while en route to what was then Ottoman-controlled Palestine. The sheikh told him about some Bedouin who had discovered a number of blackened strips of old parchment in a cave above the Wadi al-Mujib. And that's where we need to turn to some serious scholarly detective work.
Sherlock Holmes here. About 10 years earlier, the Ottomans had implemented reforms forcing the Bedouin to recognize Turkish sovereignty. In response, a group of Bedouin fled south from Damascus, taking refuge in a cave. That was when they came upon a bundle wrapped in cloth. Hoping to find gold or some treasure, they hastily unwrapped their find, only to discover a series of blackened strips of leather, their backsides covered with an asphalt-like resin. With the help of an Arab middleman named Salim, Shapira was able to acquire a total of 16 parchment strips in several lots. They were folded so that a surface containing text always touched another surface containing text. Written in Paleo-Hebrew, otherwise known as Phoenician, they comprised an abbreviated version of the book of Deuteronomy. The text corresponded to what many scholars independently theorized the book of Deuteronomy might have looked like before scribes of later generations expanded and enhanced it. Shapira came to believe that he may have been looking at a copy of the actual text, set down by Moses himself.
Hercule Poirot here, the world's greatest detective. Years before, Shapira had been duped by a whole collection of supposedly ancient Moabite pottery, which he acquired from the Bedouin and sold at a substantial profit. He had taken no part in the forgery of these items, and he honestly believed them to be genuine. But his good name was stained nonetheless. Now he felt his reputation might be seriously rehabilitated by the discovery of the most important biblical manuscripts ever to come to light.
Shapira sent his own transcription of the text to a professor who had supported him during the Moabitica scandal, Konstantin Schlatman, who shared it with the renowned professor Franz Delitzsch. But these two German scholars called it a sophisticated but at the same time crude forgery. Shapira harbored doubts himself, since it did not agree with the canonical version of the Bible. Others, however, felt that the fragments were likely authentic, including the pastor of the Church of the Redeemer in Jerusalem and Professor Paul Schroeder, who had served as German consul of Beirut. But German Protestant theologian and Orientalist Hermann Strack discounted the authenticity of the fragments before even seeing them.
Ultimately, in 1883, Shapira made his way to Europe, first traveling to Leipzig, where he presented his parchments to a group of scholars to look at them together and render a verdict. After spending only an hour and a half examining them, their unanimous conclusion was that these were clever forgeries. But two scholars in particular, his friend Hermann Goethe and another, Edward Meyer, from the University of Leipzig, were utterly certain that the parchments were genuine, though Goethe would later denounce them as fraudulent. Meyer sent a telegram to Adolf Ehrmann, a distinguished Orientalist in Berlin, inviting him to Leipzig to see the fragments for himself. According to Meyer, Ehrmann fell into archaeological delight and declared that he would eat all of the strips if they were not genuine.
Among the 16 fragments, there were 42 columns of text. A closer look revealed that the strips comprised 2 copies of the same body of text, each matching the other with a fair degree of exactness. It appeared that there were originally 2 scrolls measuring approximately 11.5 feet each, with text arranged in 21 columns. Vertical scroll marks were present on each side of the text, and seemed to be guides for writing, though the scribe had not stayed strictly within the boundaries. The strips were only a few inches in height. Another distinguished professor, Dr. Franz Hoffmann, examined the manuscript for approximately 2 hours, finding nothing suspicious.
Shapira then set out for Berlin to obtain a review of the manuscript. At the home of Karl Lepsius, head of the Royal Library at Berlin, a group of scholars carefully studied the fragments, but one scholar after another rejected their genuineness. Some reports later confirmed that they actually made an offer to Shapira to buy the manuscript, but that the amount was unacceptable.
Daunted, Shapira proceeded to London, where 2 of Shapira's fragments were put on display in the British Museum. A number of scholars examined them, and one professor of Hebrew exclaimed, "This is one of the few things which could not be a forgery and a fraud." Serious negotiations were undertaken, reportedly resulting in an offer by the museum to buy the 16 fragments for a total of £1 million. The offer was of course contingent on their validation, a task delegated to famed British biblical scholar Christian David Ginsburg, who was quoted as follows:
"The writing of the Shapira manuscript seems not to be a picked alphabet, but current, and this is in favor of the genuineness of the document."
During the weeks that Ginsburg spent analyzing the texts, the parchments at the British Museum garnered enormous interest and huge crowds, including British Prime Minister William Gladstone. Meanwhile, noted French Orientalist and archaeologist Charles Clermont-Ganneau arrived on the scene. He had already gained a reputation of being a debunker of deceptions, and he was convinced that Shapira's scroll fragments amounted to one more case of forgery for profit. Clermont-Ganneau was only permitted to examine 2 or 3 of the fragments, but he pronounced them to be fakes.
These are my conclusions. The fragments are the work of a modern-day forger. I am able to show, with the documents before me, how the forger went to work. He took one of those large synagogue rolls of leather containing the Pentateuch, written in square Hebrew character and perhaps dating back 2 or 3 centuries, scrolls which Mr. Shapira must be well acquainted with, for he deals with them, and has sold to several of the public libraries of England sundry copies of them, obtained from the existing synagogues of Judea and of the Yemen. The forger then cut off the lower edge of the scroll, that which offered him the widest surface. He obtained in this way some narrow strips of leather with an appearance of comparative antiquity, which was still further heightened by the use of the proper chemical agents. On the strips of leather he wrote with ink, making use of the alphabet of the Moabite stone, and introducing such various readings as fancy dictated. The passages from Deuteronomy, which have been deciphered and translated by M. Ginsburg with patience and learning worthy of better employment. Who is the forger? That is a question which does not concern me.
Clermont-Ganneau declared them to have been sliced from the lower portion of Eastern Torah scrolls, even though he had not been able to compare such scrolls with Shapira's fragments. Not long afterwards, Ginsburg released his own findings. In a letter to the British Museum, he wrote,
"The manuscript of Deuteronomy which Mr. Shapira submitted to us for examination is a forgery. The narrow slits of leather on which it was written are cut off from the margin of synagogue scrolls. The columns of these scrolls are bounded on the right and left by vertical lines drawn with a hard point. Now, the Shapira fragments exhibit these lines with a dry point, but not as boundaries to the margin, for the writing on them extends on each side beyond the lines, thus confirming the theory that they originally formed the ruled margins of legally written scrolls. There were no less than 4 or 5 different persons engaged in the production of the forgery, a Polish, Russian, or German Jew, or one who had learned Hebrew in the north of Europe.
Shapira replied to this damning verdict in a letter, writing as follows: Dear Dr. Ginsburg, you have made a fool of me by publishing and exhibiting things that you believe them to be false. I do not think I shall be able to survive this shame, although I am not yet convinced that the manuscript is a forgery unless M. Gano did it. I will leave London in a day or two for Berlin.
After these declarations of forgery, the manuscripts were removed from public display at the British Museum. Soon after Ginsburg's report, Shapira left London for Berlin. The London Times subsequently reported that the German scholars in Berlin had known all along that the fragments had been forged. Many assumed that Moses Shapira was the clever forger. As the scholarly world lined up to denounce the manuscripts, Shapira came to Amsterdam, likely because in nearby Leiden, an international congress of Orientalists was about to take place. Perhaps he could find fresh support among those scholars. He also wrote to the chief librarian of the British Museum, Edward Augustus Bond, begging him,
Let the manuscript be examined by several scholars and archaeologists of different schools and doctrines.
But Shapira's pleas went unanswered. He had with him a single strip of text, while 15 leather strips remained at the British Museum. He moved on from Amsterdam to Rotterdam. In February 1884, he rented a room at a guest house and subsequently shot himself, committing suicide. He was 51 years old. His family back in Jerusalem sold nearly everything in order to pay off their creditors. Shapira's eldest daughter, Augusta, had been engaged to Professor Schroeder's son, but with news of the evolving scandal, the engagement was broken. The British Museum did not return the 15 leather strips to Shapira's widow. Instead, they were sold at auction to a bookseller for the trivial sum of £10, 5 shillings. Years later, in 1887, they were briefly displayed in London's Royal Hall during the Anglo-Jewish Historical Exhibition. No mention was made that they had been declared a forgery. About a year later, they were sold yet again, presumably for £20, to one Philip Brooks Mason, who later presented a paper titled The Forgery of Shapira. Thereafter, all attempts to track down the fragments have turned up nothing. All that remains are 19th century facsimiles of the manuscript, copied meticulously by hand, clearly displaying the Paleo-Hebrew characters. Ginsburg also made drawings, though for paleographic purposes, they are not dependable.
Recently, a prominent scholar, Idan Dershowitz of the University of Potsdam, has examined the entire case afresh.
Obtaining and reviewing Shapira's private papers, he concluded that it is highly unlikely that the fragments had been forged. This is because Shapira, in his own journals, struggles to make sense of the parchments and what they mean. If he had been the forger, why would he be attempting to decipher them? Shapira certainly himself believed that the manuscripts were genuine. Moreover, if they had in fact been forged, then Shapira was likely the victim of the hoax, not its perpetrator. But who else might have forged them? The Bedouin, the Arab middleman. They certainly didn't have the knowledge or expertise to create such a manuscript, and if somehow they had such knowledge, why would they have sold the fragments for a relative pittance to Shapira? The only one with a financial motive was Shapira himself, who tried to sell them for £1 million. But again, Shapira would not have been struggling to understand a text that he himself had forged.
The only explanation that makes sense is that these fragments were genuine, possibly representing the oldest biblical manuscript ever recovered, dating from the First Temple period. Was this the actual forerunner of the book of Deuteronomy? Was this a copy of the text that Moses himself had produced? Or perhaps a copy of a copy of a copy? It's certainly possible that some of the fragments survived and may one day resurface. If so, the world of biblical scholarship will literally be turned on its head.